Is Russian President Vladimir Putin actually dead? Per a new op-ed piece in The Hill, reports of Putin's death might not be greatly exaggerated.
Professor of political science at Rutgers University, New York, Alexander Motyl has just more than a hunch, and he joins us now to break down his argument. Welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
So we're at a place... Sorry, go ahead. I'll let you open us up.
No, please.
I'm curious, you talked about, the realists making their analysis of the Russia-Ukraine situation. About 100,000 deaths on either side are being reported. A lot of folks are making this kind of utilitarian calculation. Is the United States funding Ukraine going to make the situation better or worse? Is the continuation of the fighting making the situation better or worse, with the calculation being around human lives lost? Now, you said in your piece that you think that the realists assessing this conflict are naive. You didn't just say that you disagree with them. Can you explain to our listeners why you believe they are naive?
Well, they seem to think that Russia can be satisfied simply by Ukraine's making certain kinds of territorial concessions. So in other words, the bottom line is Ukraine agrees to the fact that Russia will continue to occupy the territories it occupies. In return, there's either a ceasefire or a peace of some kind and so on. Well, would that were only the case. But it's naive to believe, and hence the use of my use of the word naive. It's naive to believe that Vladimir Putin, or for that matter, the Russian elites in general, will simply stop, simply because Ukraine has agreed to what seems to be a temporary loss of its territories. They will resume their assault, just as they resumed the assault in 2022. Remember, the war against Ukraine began not in 2022, but in 2014, in the aftermath of the so-called Revolution of Dignity. It's then that Russia captured half of the Donbass and all of the Crimea. And then it resumed the war, again, the fighting war, in February 24th, 2022. So if Russia is given what it wants, which is essentially what the realists are arguing, give them these territories and then they'll stop, it will not stop. It will simply continue. And sooner or later, as the Ukrainians fear, their turn will come once again, but this time Russia will be stronger, its military will be stronger, and it's conceivable that Western determination to stop Russia and to help Ukraine will be weaker in the immediate future, or at least in the foreseeable future. So hence the charge of naivete. You can't deal with a dictator like Putin, or for that matter, with a dictator like Adolf Hitler, by assuming that they're nice, reasonable individuals who have limited goals. They're neither nice nor reasonable, and their goals are certainly not limited.
In your op-ed, you write about this Russian Telegram channel and a Russian political analyst, Valery Solovey, who are circulating claims that Vladimir Putin might actually be dead. And you give basically two possibilities, which is that, yes, Vladimir Putin is actually dead and it's not as crazy as it seems, or that this is a potential strategy by the opposition party to sow discord and confusion. Which do you think is the more likely scenario?
Well, I think the latter one is more likely. I wouldn't exclude or preclude the possibility that he's actually dead. Solovey has been right in many of his predictions. He's also been wrong in many of his predictions. But this isn't a prediction. This is a supposed statement of fact. And what's striking about this is the detail to which they go, so that he apparently died at 10:42 p.m. There were a whole bunch of doctors. They were locked up. Then eventually Putin's body has been supposedly deposited in a refrigerator in his bunker. Now, of course, if this is all just fake news, that's what you would expect, detail. But if it's truthful, it's also what you would expect, detail. So it's conceivable that this actually happened. Mr. Solovey continually says that this is a, quote, phantasmagorical scenario, but then he always adds, but this is Russia after all. So he's got a point. That said, personally, I'm somewhat skeptical. I'd say there's a 1 in 5, 1 in 10 chance that he's really dead. And that far more likely is that this is a somewhat elaborate attempt, either by Solovey and his opposition friends, or by Solovey and elements within the Russian elite, to discredit Putin, to sow confusion, to create the impression that he's not really in charge, or that if he is, he's barely able to make decisions. Central to this claim, by the way, is that there is actually a double who's been taking Putin's place at a variety of public functions over the last few months. And the irony is, and this is of some significance, that several months ago, when Solovey and this General SVR were making claims about a Putin double, the vast majority of Russian commentators said, pshaw, it's not true, it's not possible. Now, I'd say there's pretty much unanimous agreement that Putin really does have a double. Now, of course, everybody could be wrong, but chances are they're not. So there seems to be a double, and this double seems to have played a significant role in representing Putin. And then when you add these two elements together, that Putin may indeed be dead, and at the same time that his double may be alive and well, it's not inconceivable, but again, unlikely, but not inconceivable, that Solovey is right in saying that Putin is dead, his double has taken his place, and that sooner or later, however, the consensus regarding his double will collapse, and what we'll see is savage infighting within the Kremlin. All of that sounds more or less plausible, minus the possibility that Putin is indeed dead. But even if he's alive, the bottom line is that the elites are mobilizing, they're sharpening their lives. Someone is clearly out to get Putin. And none of this bespeaks a stable Russian regime.
That's absolutely fascinating as a foil to this conflict. I think about the people within Ukraine and the state of the country, how there have been so many people rising up in the ranks of office and then losing their positions. Zelensky spoke recently. We had reports of his staff talking about this corruption within Ukraine. I think about a heavily armed populace after this conflict. I'm wondering, what kind of a Ukraine are we defending here by continuing this war? You made a really nuanced argument in your piece that you don't believe NATO escalation was the main reason we had Putin invade Ukraine, that he decided to do so in 2021, and that also the argument for continuing the war isn't just that, Russia is uniquely evil, Russia is always bad, it's that Russia wants to destroy the state of Ukraine and the people within it, many of them. Now, what do you make of the continuation of war? Does that promise to also do the same and destroy a bit of the civilization living in Ukraine and deconstruct a lot of their government with the extent of corruption we've seen since the beginning of the conflict?
Well, again, the trope about Ukraine being this incredibly corrupt place is it's somewhat of an exaggeration. It's not significantly more corrupt than Romania, Bulgaria. It's significantly less corrupt than Russia, less corrupt than Moldova. So it's pretty much on par with its neighbors. Ukraine is fundamentally a democracy. And the remarkable thing, again, it's an imperfect democracy. It's hardly, Norway or Sweden, but it is a democratic state. The people have rallied around the president, Mr. Zelensky, who's been doing a very good job over the last 2 years. And despite the war, this is a significant part, despite the war and the destruction that it's caused, Ukraine has remained a democratic state with the free press, right to assemble and everything else. So it's managed to hold on to its core values, which it says are European, despite the conflict, the death, and the destruction. Now, the other question is also very important, and that is to say, wouldn't Ukraine be better off if the war were to end tomorrow? Well, of course, yes. It would be better off if the war ended tomorrow, but it all depends on the circumstances of the ending. If Putin remains in power, let's assume he is actually alive, if Putin remains in power, he will not abandon his ambition, his goal of destroying the Ukrainians. It's not an exaggeration to say that Ukrainians are to Putin, they fulfill the same role for Putin as Jews did for Adolf Hitler. He detests them. Putin detests the Ukrainians. He doesn't understand why they exist. He doesn't understand why they want to exist. He believes that they shouldn't exist. And his minions, his propagandists, his sidekicks, they're extremely explicit in the fact that they want to destroy the Ukrainian nation. I've heard many commentaries on Russian television where the propagandists who lead the talk shows say explicitly that if the Ukrainians don't get on board and give up their nationhood, their identity, and their state, it is Russia's obligation to destroy them, as in kill them, even if it means millions. So the genocidal intent is fairly open. I mean, the Russians are not hiding it. So the choice before Ukraine is, if you settle on Russians' terms, you die, because essentially Russians' terms involve the genocide of the Ukrainian nations, or you fight in the hope and or expectation that you'll be able to, if not utterly defeat the Russian forces, at least keep them at bay. Ukraine has no other choice. It's either die or fight. And inasmuch as Ukraine is important, this is the point that some Americans don't fully understand. It's not just important because it's a nice place, it's a democracy, human rights are being violated. It's the only thing keeping this kind of imperial aggressive Russia from Europe and America's allies in Europe. It's the wall separating Putin's aggressive imperialist Russia, from the rest of Europe. If Ukraine falls, the geopolitical consequences for Europe and hence for the United States will be immense, and none of them will be positive. So stopping Putin in his tracks, preferably, and as soon as possible, is not only good politics, it's not only good geopolitics for Ukraine, it's actually indispensable, good and very good geopolitics for the West.
Professor, thank you so much for joining today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We've got more Rising After